Today, most of us would be shocked to see someone buying human beings as though they were livestock or used cars, or tearing a child from its mother's arms to sell it to the highest bidder, or whipping men and women without mercy, or simply working them to death. And yet, for most of our history as human beings, in every part of our planet, that's how people who called themselves masters treated the people they called slaves.
It's about exploitation, it's about injustice, it's about violence.
We had no rights because you were, of course, property.
The whole notion of owning a slave is horrific to us today, that you could own another person. But it was a way of buying labor, which is what people needed.
But how could people put their economic needs ahead of the humanity of their fellow beings? And how could this horrific system have lasted for so long?
No one will freely choose to be a slave. The only way you can become a slave is by force.
The truth about why people held slaves, and why most of them finally set them free, is at the heart of a surprising story. The story of the world's unfinished journey from slavery to freedom. From the beginning of history, slavery has been a part of human life. All of our great civilizations, and most of the monuments they left behind, were built on the backs of slaves.
Trying to face up to the real history of slavery is also having to face up to the fact that human beings lived in, with, and on the profits of slavery for virtually all of human history.
Slavery seems to be fundamental to the way we relate to one another as human beings. It seems to always be there in some form. Sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's more benign.
Slavery first took a relatively benign form in ancient cultures in China, Babylonia, and Assyria. Here, slavery usually wasn't a lifetime sentence, and it wasn't inherited. Even in ancient Egypt, slaves were usually prisoners of war who served their conquerors until a treaty could be signed or a ransom paid. Then they went home. But this was just the beginning of slavery's savage history.
From that point, it takes on thousands, at least thousands, of different cultural forms, historical forms, different kinds of societies invented in different ways.
Greece, 387 BC. Plato, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, traveled from Athens to the island of Sicily to give the local ruler, Dionysius, some advice on government. But when Plato dared to accuse Dionysius of being a tyrant, the outraged king ordered his guards to seize the philosopher and sell him to the highest bidder. Suddenly, Plato was facing a future he himself had described as a fate worse than death.
Well, becoming a slave could be a fate worse than death. And certainly in ancient Greece, to become a slave also meant that you were completely alienated from any chance of your children ever having any kind of inheritance. You became a non-person, really.
These non-persons were vital to the Greeks, who had created the world's first true slave society, a society that depended on the work of slaves for its very existence. To supply their ever-growing need for labor, the Greeks began to transform slavery from a short-term condition into a life sentence for slaves and all their descendants. And anyone was at risk.
Anybody essentially could become a slave. Slavery was never based on race, like later on in the United States. There was essentially no external distinguishing factor, not as if you had to be, black to be a slave.
As Plato had discovered, falling into slavery had become as easy as being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or just saying the wrong thing. Fortunately for the philosopher, his friends and family learned of his plight. They rushed to the slave market just in time to buy him back from his captors. Plato returned to Athens with his freedom intact. But his close call may have forced him to rethink the way slavery was practiced in Greece. For the rest of his life, he would argue that it was only right to enslave barbarians, not civilized men like himself and his fellow Greeks.
people have had to think of slaves as others in many ways to give themselves permission to enslave them. I mean, it's very difficult to take a human being and treat them as you would an animal, or even less well than you might an animal, if you do not have some way of diminishing the humanity of that person.
Plato's brightest pupil, Aristotle, learned this lesson well.
In Aristotle's view, there are natural slaves. People are born into a condition which makes them susceptible to being slaves. And that becomes an argument for justifying the enslavement of conquered peoples, but also the enslavement of peoples that don't seem civilized.
In his great work on politics, Aristotle put this view into words that would be used to justify slavery for the next 2,000 years.
It is clear that some men are by nature free, and others slaves, and that for the latter, slavery is both expedient and right. All would acknowledge, then, that the inferior class should be slaves of the superior.
The Greeks had reached a key turning point in the history of slavery. From now on, people would justify the enslavement of others by claiming that their victims were less human or less deserving of freedom. In the next few centuries, a new empire would spread this concept of slavery across the known world and take it to unprecedented levels of brutality. Rome, AD 61. Shocking news spread through the city. Pedanius Secundus, one of the most powerful men in the empire, had been murdered by one of his own slaves. No act was more terrifying to the citizens of Rome, who lived their lives surrounded by thousands of slaves.
Large households could have up to 4,000 or 5,000 slaves. That would be primarily on the agricultural estates, but you would also have a fairly high amount of slavery within the city of Rome. So whatever the exact numbers, there were always probably more slaves than non-slaves in a city like Rome, Alexandria, Milan, or any other big city in the Roman Empire.
For the Romans, the greatest challenge was forcing these vast numbers of slaves to accept their fate without provoking them to rise up in revolt. The ever-present danger of a slave uprising kept many Romans constantly on edge and made crimes like the murder of Pedanius Secundus especially terrifying. For centuries, Romans had tried to protect themselves by making the murder of a master by a slave the ultimate offense. And it wasn't just the killer himself who was expected to pay the price. Tradition demanded that all 400 slaves belonging to Pedanius pay for his murder with their lives.
The punishment had to be and was considered to be absolutely draconian, yes, for all to see. Why? Because there was this continuous fear if you let one slave, rise up against the master, you're going to have bedlam.
But a different kind of bedlam arose when an angry crowd rushed to the Senate to protest the verdict. Slaves might be property, they insisted, but they are also human beings. Cassius, a member of one of Rome's most distinguished families, would have none of it. With the fate of the slaves hanging in the balance, he rose in the Senate to issue a call for justice, Roman style.
Vote mercy in heaven's name, and then who will be kept safe by the number of his slaves? And 400 have not protected Pedanius Secundus.
In the end, Cassius's call for the strict enforcement of Roman law prevailed. As soldiers held back the slaves' horrified defenders, executioners dragged all 400 of the men, women, and children who had belonged to Pedanius to the place of execution and slaughtered them. Not even their pleas to their pagan gods could save them. But would a new God be any more merciful? Rome, in the year 596. A new ruler reigned over a city very different from the Rome that had seen the murder of Pedanius Secundus, and very much the same. His name was Gregory. History remembers him as Pope Gregory the Great. In 596, the Pope had a problem regarding slaves, but it wasn't the problem people in our time might expect.
Frequently, people think that Christianity really profoundly changed the lot of slavery. And of course, it's beautiful to imagine that, Christianity is this saving religion, which is a religion which basically helps those in bondage. And unfortunately, like so much else, the reality is quite different.
The reality was that Gregory was eager to buy some slaves. As heir to imperial Rome, his church now owned vast tracts of land. Fields still needed to be plowed. Goods still needed to be manufactured. And owning slaves seemed like the only sure way to get the work done.
What is very important to recognize about Christianity is that it evolves in a slave-owning society. And if you are a member of a slave-owning society, you will not question that institution prima facie at all.
Instead of questioning slavery, Gregory and his fellow Christians merely adapted Aristotle's ancient ideas about who should or shouldn't be a slave to fit the times. They forbade the enslavement of Christians and decreed that only non-Christians deserved to be slaves, leaving Gregory free to buy all the slaves he needed in pagan places like Britain and bring them back to Rome. It seemed that in Christendom, at least, slavery was here to stay. But Christianity wasn't the only new faith to embrace this ancient institution. Arabia, in the middle of the 7th century. A prophet named Muhammad was preaching a new religion called Islam and giving his followers some new advice about slaves.
A man came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and said, "Guide me to a deed that makes me close to heaven and far from hell." The Prophet replied, "Free a person and redeem a slave."
Muhammad, more than any Christian leader of his time, seemed to recognize slavery's inhumanity. But he and his new religion continued to take slavery for granted. Muhammad himself owned slaves, and once allowed his followers to slaughter hundreds of men from a non-Muslim tribe that had betrayed him, and take the women and children as slaves. But he protected his own followers from meeting a similar fate by forbidding the enslavement of Muslims by Muslims, just as Christians were forbidden to enslave Christians, which left the warriors of both faiths free to enslave each other when they met in battle during the Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries. It was the beginning of a cross-cultural competition for slaves that would continue for over 6 centuries, well into the Renaissance and beyond.
You had a flourishing slave trade in Venice in the Renaissance. Flourishing. Of course, at that point in time, indeed, you could no longer trade in Christian slaves, so you traded in Muslim slaves.
But by the 1400s, the Muslims had created a society as powerful as Christian Europe. Any non-Muslim who ventured to the Middle East or North Africa in search of slaves now risked being enslaved in turn. For their own safety, Europeans had to find other sources for the slaves they prized. Over the next few centuries, their search would lead to new places and a new type of slavery. A slavery based on race. (1755), West Africa. An 11-year-old boy named Olaudah Equiano was playing in his yard when he was suddenly kidnapped. His captors dragged him through the forest to the Atlantic coast. There he was cleaned up and placed in a holding cell with other Africans to await the arrival of European slave traders who made frequent stops along the coast to pick up human cargo like Equiano.
People are terrified. They're separated from their families, from loved ones, maybe have seen them slaughtered where they've come from. People are hungry and they may be ill. They are being prepared, basically, and cleaned up to be purchased at the seaside and then put on boats to travel across the seas.
But Equiano and his fellow captives weren't bound for Europe. They were being shipped off to the new European colonies in America. There, slaves were in high demand and brought top prices. Africans had become a hot commodity in a thriving transatlantic slave trade that had started over 300 years before Equiano was captured and would last for almost 100 more. During those centuries, 13 million innocent victims just like Equiano would be stolen from their homes and sent into slavery. Years later, Equiano would recall his time on a slave ship as the darkest moments of his life.
The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions, some of whom were almost daily brought upon deck at the point of death, which I began to hope would soon put an end to my miseries.
As an adult, Equiano finally regained his freedom and found fame as a passionate opponent of this inhuman commerce. But most of his fellow captives weren't so lucky. Up to 20% of the men, women, and children forced into the dark holds of these ships died under the cruel and crowded conditions. The survivors were doomed to give their lives to taming a harsh and unfamiliar land.
The need for labor was profound. We were in a heavily forested, otherwise occupied territory. The thought was, if you take a people out of their home place and you drop them in a new place that is significantly far, and you mix up their numbers, you can control that group of people much better. And you've got a group of people who are clearly identifiable as a servant class.
But how could their new masters make sure that the members of this servant class remained servants? And how could they justify the brutal oppression needed to keep their slaves from rising up in revolt? In places like the American South, slave owners once again looked back to the revered cultures of ancient Greece and Rome to find the answers.
They said, this is simply the way human beings have always lived. You know, we are creating a society based on slavery in exactly the way the noble ancient Greeks created their society, the way the noble Romans created their society. And they, you know, all of those buildings with those big white columns in the Deep South were an echo of the slave-holding classical society of the Greeks and Romans that the Southerners very consciously took up as a symbol of their life, a cultured, sophisticated life, but based upon a slave economy.
There's a direct line from Aristotle straight through the beginnings of slavery in the New World. He's used right up through the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries to justify natural hierarchies that'll permit enslavement as a just condition.
But Aristotle had never based his idea of slavery on race. So, Southerners turned to their Bibles to find a justification for the enslavement of people based on the color of their skin. They found it in the story of Noah. According to Genesis, Noah, in a moment of rage, had condemned the children of his son Ham to be servants for all time. Southerners claimed that Ham's descendants had settled in Africa. Therefore, Africans were born to be slaves. The proof was in their black skin, the mark of Noah's curse.
Being black in the United States was at some level a mark of slavery. Blackness was understood to be a mark of degradation, which went along with slavery.
Armed with the arguments of Aristotle and their own reinterpretation of the Bible, Southerners began to enshrine racial slavery in the laws of the land.
All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate.
All Negroes and other slaves already imported or hereafter to be imported into this province, and all children now born or hereafter to be born of such Negroes and slaves shall be slaves during their natural lives.
It was economically expedient to enslave people and to make that slavery perpetual and hereditary. You didn't have to pay a slave. It cost certainly a lot to buy a slave, but that $500 or $600, $800 you might have paid for a teenage male would pay itself, it would be paid off. It would be a wise expenditure in the long run.
By the mid-1700s, the enslavement of Africans had been transformed into a very profitable enterprise. But even as the trade in black slaves reached its peak, some people began to wonder how slavery, and especially slavery based solely on race, could ever be justified. Paris, in the 1700s, in a time history calls the Enlightenment. Our understanding of the natural world had been transformed by the scientific methods pioneered by Isaac Newton. Now a group of philosophers was trying to use those same methods of observation to investigate the nature of man.
And once you start doing that, you start asking a whole new set of questions. What is man? What is human nature? What do we observe when we look at man and nature? He's free, that's his most natural state, and he's equal.
Before that, we were really talking about chains of being and where people were on that sort of ladder of being. Whites were at the top, and then from there we went ethnically, we sort of marched down. And Africans were thought to be very much like primates, like apes. So we were at the bottom of that chain, or near the bottom of that chain.
The Enlightenment's rejection of this hierarchy was a direct attack on the way the Western world had thought about slavery since the days of Aristotle almost 2,000 years before. Charles, the Baron de Montesquieu, one of the most influential thinkers of the time, led the charge.
Aristotle endeavors to prove that there are natural slaves, but what he says is far from proving it. As all men are born equal, slavery must be accounted unnatural.
These are extremely radical ideas in the beginning. They are being talked about between a very small number of people in private settings. They are so radical that they are absolutely censored.
It would take Voltaire, one of the most popular authors of the day, to finally bring the Enlightenment's radical anti-slavery message to a wider audience.
Slavery is an innovation that violates man's original free nature. Partisans sometimes suggest that a poor laborer would rather be a pampered slave. But as the laborer, he will cling to his freedom. And a slave, in turn, will choose freedom over slavery, even if he must leave the kindest of masters to face unseen hardships.
The Enlightenment idea that man is born free and equal in nature created a philosophically coherent basis for challenging the notion of slavery. It was irrefutable. It still is to this day. And it's the strongest weapon that was available then, and it's the strongest weapon that we still have today for arguing against slavery wherever we find it.
The last slave was sold in Paris in 1762, and in 1794, slavery itself would be banned throughout France. But in the rest of Europe and the Americas, including the newly formed United States, slaves were still waiting for freedom to arrive. Upstate New York, the early 1800s. Thousands gathered to join in a great Protestant religious revival that was sweeping through England and America. They called it the Great Awakening. It would make people look at slavery in a whole new way.
Lots of religious sects are beginning to take root and spring up in the United States, and people are trying to cleanse the nation of its sins. Part of that sin is slavery.
In the Protestant countries, Christianity played a much stronger role in the abolitionist movement because Protestantism was already a more egalitarian religion to begin with. It had rejected the notion of a church hierarchy from the papacy downward, and it believed that every individual had a direct relationship to God.
Protestant England abolished slavery in 1833. But in the United States, the religious campaign to end slavery still faced enormous resistance from slave owners and their advocates. Across America, a new generation of abolitionists was convinced that the time for ending slavery had arrived.
Religious speakers, black and white, male and female, as we close in on the Civil War, talk about slavery in the middle of their sermons, where they might not have talked about it before. Slavery comes up not only as a sin on the nation, but it becomes the individual's sin as well. So it's not just that you own slaves, but that you don't act against slavery in a more political way.
But in the American South, these moral and political arguments were winning few converts. Slaves were worth 3 times the value of all of the nation's railroads, manufacturing, and industry combined. Their labor produced most of the goods the country exported. Southern slave owners feared that without slaves, the economy would collapse.
And then you get contortions, intellectual, philosophical, religious contortions, as they attempt to explain why a country that is based on universal liberties allows slavery as well. I mean, it's a contradiction that tore them to pieces and ultimately cost hundreds of thousands of lives.
Outraged Southerners like Confederate President Jefferson Davis claimed to see no contradiction in a way of life as old as time itself.
Slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible in both Testaments. It has existed in all ages and has been found among the people of the highest civilizations.
But the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening had changed the way people looked at slaves. Voltaire's powerful arguments had won over former supporters of slavery like Abraham Lincoln.
If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Although volume upon volume is written to prove slavery is a very good thing, we never hear of the man who wishes to take the good of it by being a slave himself. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally.
In the end, it would take a devastating civil war and the deaths of almost 600,000 Americans to resolve the crisis. With the South's surrender and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in December 1865, legal slavery in the United States finally came to an end. But the world's journey from slavery to freedom was far from over.
People tend to believe that slavery is a thing of the past. And interestingly, you know, in the United States particularly, we tend to pat ourselves on the back and say, well, we got rid of slavery. But there are something like 27 million people in slavery today.
From places like the Sudan in North Africa to Southeast Asia, and even Europe and the Americas, people are still being enslaved.
Slavery right now is ugly. Whether it's people selling their children into slavery, especially their daughters, or girls being kidnapped into slavery for their sexual labor and other, simple work, is it's horrific. It's even hard to describe once you read about it and learn about it.
Today, slavery has become harder to detect and define. Many people are tricked into slavery through fraudulent contracts or loans. They do the same labor as other impoverished people, but without pay or the freedom to leave.
Slaves today may have it a little harder than slaves in human history. The key difference is that slaves that would have cost a lot of money in the past now cost very, very little indeed, because there's a glut of potential slaves on the market. And that means that slaves today are disposable in a way that they never were in the past. If they get injured, they're not given medical care. If they get sick, they're not given medical care. They're not given enough food to necessarily keep them alive for very long, because they're so cheap, you just use them up and throw them away.
But there are signs of hope. Slavery is now illegal in every country in the world, and the fight to end this ancient crime against humanity is gaining new momentum.
Any kind of slavery is a condition of tyranny, and therefore can't be sustained as a just society or a good society.
There are a handful of criminals who are still invested in the idea of having slavery, but 99.9% of all human beings are agreed slavery should stop. They don't want to live in a world of slavery. There are new United Nations conventions, there are new anti-slavery organizations, there are new groups to liberate slaves around the world. To me, it's incredibly exciting to think that this could be the generation, that after 5,000 years, this could be the generation that could leave a gift to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to say, this is the generation that brought an end to slavery.